The summer of 1873 left no mercy on the land. The sun beat down on the Arizona territory like a hammer on an anvil. Relentless, unforgiving, hot enough to crack the earth itself into 1,000 dry, broken pieces. Dust devils spun through ghost towns. Rivers ran thin and brown. And somewhere out on the Sonoran plain, a man knelt in chains. He didn't beg. He didn't cry. He simply stared at the horizon with eyes that had seen things no man should ever see. Eyes that held a fire so deep, so quiet. It scared the men who owned him. They didn't know what they had. They didn't know his name was Cale. Not the name the slavers had given him. Not the broken, mumbled nickname the auction men used. His real name. The name whispered by his mother beside a fire under 10,000 stars. The name that meant thunder born from silence in the language of his people. They had no idea they were selling an Apache prince. And the woman who bought him for $2 silver? She had no idea either. But she was about to find out. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. Sending love your way wherever you are. This is a story about chains and fire. About what it means to be free when the world has already decided you aren't. About a woman with a past just as broken as the man she purchased, and the strange, violent, beautiful collision that followed. Stay with me, because this story, it doesn't go where you think it's going. Her name was Clara Voss, and she rode into the town of Red Rock Flats the way most people left it. Fast, quiet, and with something heavy sitting behind her eyes. Red Rock Flats was not a town that appeared on any official map. It existed the way rumors exist, barely, and with no good reason. A collection of sun-bleached buildings slouched against the red rock walls of a canyon in southern Arizona. One saloon, one general store, one livery, and a trading post that sold things you couldn't find anywhere decent. Furs, weapons, whiskey, and sometimes people. Clara was 31 years old. She was not a soft woman. She had the kind of face that had once been beautiful and still was, but in the way a desert landscape is beautiful. Striking, austere, carved by wind and loss into something that demanded respect rather than tenderness. Her hair was dark brown, tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen too many seasons. Her coat was the color of old leather. Her boots were covered in red dust that never quite came off, no matter how many times she tried. She had ridden 4 hours to get here. She hadn't planned on buying anyone. She'd come for feed, for flour, for a few supplies to carry back to the small ranch she was barely keeping alive 40 miles east of town. Just her, 2 horses, and a piece of land her late husband had left her along with 3 unpaid debts and a leaking roof. Life had not been kind to Clara Voss, but she had refused, every single morning, to let it break her. She tied her horse outside the trading post and stepped inside. It smelled of tobacco and something older, something sour. The floorboards groaned beneath her boots. A man behind the counter barely looked up. A wide, greasy fellow named Tolliver with a smile that never reached his eyes. He nodded at her like she was a regular, which she wasn't. "What'll it be, ma'am?" Clara moved through the shelves, picking out what she needed. Flour, salt, a small tin of coffee. She was nearly done when she heard it. Not a sound exactly. A silence that was louder than sound. She turned her head. In the far corner of the trading post, half hidden behind a wooden partition that tried and failed to separate the trading floor from what lay behind it, there was a man. He was sitting on the ground, chained at the wrists and ankles. His shirt, if you could call it that anymore, was torn in ways that told a story she didn't want to read too closely. His skin was dark bronze, weathered, marked with thin scars that ran in careful, deliberate patterns across his forearms. Not the random scars of violence, but something older. Something intentional. He was lean but not weak. Even sitting on the floor in chains, there was something about him that was impossible to ignore. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the wall. And that was what stopped her cold. Not the chains. Not the state of him. It was the way he looked at that wall. Utterly still, utterly contained, like a fire that had learned to burn without any oxygen. Like a man who had gone somewhere inside himself that no chain could reach. Clara stood there longer than she meant to. "What's this?" she finally asked, keeping her voice flat. Tolliver looked up, then followed her gaze, then smiled the smile that never reached his eyes. "There's a work slave, ma'am. Comanche raiders brought him in last week. Picked him up somewhere south. Quiet as a stone, strong as a mule. Asking $2 for him." Clara's jaw tightened. $2? "Yes, ma'am. Practically giving him away. Man's got nowhere to be, and he ain't talked since they brought him in. Might be simple-minded, might not be. Hard to say." Clara looked at the man in the corner again. He still hadn't moved, still hadn't looked at her. But something in the stillness changed. Just slightly, like the air had shifted, like he had noticed her noticing him, and had made some quiet, private decision about what that meant. She didn't know why she did what she did next. She never could explain it fully, not even to herself, not even years later when she'd had time to think about it. Maybe it was the scars on his forearms. So deliberate, so clearly not the marks of a slave's life but of something else. Something older and stranger. Maybe it was the way he held himself even in those chains, like a man who still knew exactly who he was. Maybe it was simply that Clara Voss had seen enough of the world to recognize when something was deeply, profoundly wrong, and she had never been very good at walking away from that. She reached into her coat pocket and put $2 on the counter. Tolliver blinked. "You sure, ma'am? Take the chains off." Tolliver hesitated, then picked up the coins. He moved around the counter slowly, produced a key, and unlocked the shackles at the man's wrists and ankles with the casual ease of a man who had done this too many times. The chains hit the floor. The man didn't move immediately. Then slowly he rose. He was taller than she'd expected. And as he stood, he finally looked at her, directly, fully, without lowering his eyes the way enslaved men had been conditioned to do. His gaze met hers with a steadiness that was almost unsettling. His eyes were black. Not dark brown. Black, like deep water, like a moonless sky. And in them, behind all the damage and the dust and the silence, there was something that made Clara feel, for just a half second, like she was the one being assessed. Like she was the one being evaluated for trustworthiness. She held his gaze. "Can you ride?" she asked. He said nothing. She picked up her supplies, turned toward the door and said over her shoulder, "There's a horse out front. You can have the brown one. Try to run, and you'll be on your own in the desert. Stay, and I'll feed you tonight." She walked out. After a moment, just a moment, she heard footsteps behind her. He was following, and neither of them knew, not yet, how much that single decision would cost them both. The ride back to Clara's ranch was 40 miles of hard country. Red rock formations rose on either side of the trail like the ruins of some ancient civilization that never existed, jagged, massive, permanently stained by a sun that had been angry at the earth for 1,000 years. The trail wound through dry creek beds and across stretches of flat, pale ground where nothing grew except brittlebush and the occasional saguaro standing alone like a broken sentinel. Clara rode in front. The man rode behind on the brown mare, her older horse, the gentle one, the one that didn't spook easily. She'd noticed immediately that he sat the horse with the easy, automatic balance of someone who had spent most of his life on horseback. Not the posture of a man who rode because he had to. The posture of a man who rode because it was natural, because it was his. She didn't speak. He didn't speak. The desert spoke for both of them, in the wind that hissed through the rock walls, in the distant cry of a hawk spiraling high above the canyon rim, in the creak and jingle of the horse's tack. Around midday, they stopped at a shallow pool fed by a thin trickle of a spring, one of those rare, stubborn little miracles that the desert occasionally offered without explanation. Clara let the horses drink. She pulled dry jerky and hard bread from her saddlebag, ate quickly, and didn't offer him any. Not out of cruelty. Out of the strange, charged uncertainty of the situation. She didn't know what to say to him. She didn't know what he was to her exactly. Not a servant, that much she'd already decided privately. But not a guest either. Not yet. Something undefined. Something without a proper name. He watered his horse, then knelt beside the pool himself and drank from his cupped hands, unhurried, with a kind of quiet dignity that made something ache faintly in Clara's chest. Then he sat back on his heels and looked at the horizon. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye. There were the scars on his arms again. 3 parallel lines on each forearm, high up near the elbow. They were old, healed so completely they had become almost silver against his skin. They were too precise, too symmetrical to be accidental. They were the marks of a ceremony. She'd seen something like them once, years ago, in a photograph in a book about the Plains peoples. Markings of rank. Markings of belonging. She cleared her throat. "I'm not going to call you whatever name they gave you in that place," she said. He looked at her. She held his gaze. "What's your actual name?" A long pause. The wind moved through the canyon. A lizard skittered across a hot, flat rock nearby. And then, quietly, so quietly she almost thought she'd imagined it, "Kale." His voice was low and rough, like it had been stored away for a long time and had almost forgotten what it felt like to move through the air. Clara nodded once. "Kale." She said it back to him, not making it into a question, just acknowledging it, returning it to him like something that had been borrowed without permission. "I'm Clara Voss. It's my ranch we're riding to. You'll have a place to sleep, food. You're not my slave." She paused. "I don't do that. What you do after you've rested is your business." He held her gaze for another long moment. Then he looked back at the horizon. She couldn't tell if he believed her. She wasn't entirely sure she blamed him for that. They rode through the long heat of the afternoon without speaking again. But the silence between them had changed slightly. It was still vast, still cautious, but something small and fragile had moved within it, like a single candle being struck in a very dark room. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was low and red, painting everything in shades of copper and shadow. Clara's place was nothing impressive. A small adobe house, sturdy enough, with a covered porch that needed new boards, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, a fenced paddock, a vegetable garden that was fighting hard against the summer heat, and a windmill that turned with a soft, irregular creak in the evening breeze. But it was hers. She'd bled for it, stayed up nights worrying over it. She'd driven off claim jumpers twice and survived one bad winter that had killed 4 of her 6 cattle. What remained was small, but it stood. Cale looked at it without expression. She showed him the barn, a corner of it where there was a clean cot, a blanket, a lamp. "This do?" He looked at the cot, then at the lamp, then at her. "Yes," he said. Those were the only words he spoke that night. Clara made a simple meal, beans, cornbread, salted pork, and left a plate outside the barn door without ceremony. She heard him pick it up. She went inside, locked nothing. She wasn't the type, and sat by the window for a while in the dark, listening to the desert night settle in around the property. Crickets, a coyote somewhere distant, the windmill creaking. She thought about his eyes, about the way he'd looked at her in that trading post before she'd even spoken to him, like he'd already weighed something and reached a conclusion. She thought about the 2 silver dollars sitting in Tolliver's greasy palm. She thought about the scars. She was almost asleep when she heard it, a sound so soft she might have dreamed it, coming from the direction of the barn. A voice, low, rhythmic, not words in any language she recognized. Not a song exactly, something older than a song, something between a song and a prayer and a breath. It rose and fell in the dark like smoke. And then it stopped. Clara lay there in the silence that followed, her heart beating just slightly too fast. Whatever Cale was, he was not what Tolliver had called him. She was becoming more certain of that with every passing hour. 3 weeks passed. The ranch moved on its rhythms. Early mornings with pale pink light over the eastern rocks. The work of feeding animals and mending fences and coaxing water from the earth. Clara was used to doing all of it alone. She'd gotten good at the kind of tired that lives in the bones rather than the muscles, the kind that sleep barely touches. Cale changed that without being asked to. He simply began working. First morning, he was up before she was. She found him repairing the paddock fence, methodically, precisely, using spare timber she'd left stacked behind the barn. He didn't ask permission. He didn't explain himself. He just worked. Second morning, she came out to find he'd fixed the barn door that had been sticking for 6 months. He'd also dug a narrow drainage channel along the side of the vegetable garden to redirect water more efficiently, using nothing but a stick and observation. Third morning, he was on the roof of the porch replacing the boards she'd meant to get to eventually, moving across the surface with a quiet, sure-footed confidence that was almost eerie to watch. Clara said nothing about it. She simply adapted. She worked beside him when it made sense, apart from him when it didn't. She stopped putting his meals outside the barn door and started setting an extra place at the table. He came inside for dinner without comment, ate in silence, and went back to the barn. It wasn't comfortable exactly, but it had a kind of functional peace to it. The questions she wasn't asking were building up, though. She'd noticed things, small things. The way he tracked movement instinctively. A hawk, a dust cloud, a rider on a distant ridge. He would go still before she even registered there was anything to see. His eyes would narrow, his head would angle slightly, and he would process whatever it was with a speed and accuracy that didn't belong to an ordinary man. Twice she'd seen him read the wind by holding up a single finger and tilting his head, the way a hunter reads wind to avoid being smelled by prey. He knew plants. He knew the land in ways she didn't. She caught him once crouching beside a cluster of desert herbs, picking specific leaves with careful intention, drying them on a flat rock in the sun. She didn't ask what they were for. 2 days later, the headache that had been grinding behind her eyes for a week was gone, and she found a small folded square of dried leaves on the kitchen table with no explanation. She started watching him more carefully. The scars on his forearms weren't the only markings. There was something on the back of his left hand. A faded mark, almost invisible unless the light hit it right. A small geometric symbol. Angular. Deliberate. She'd seen similar patterns in the beadwork of Apache craftspeople she'd encountered years ago at a trading post in New Mexico. On a Thursday evening, dry lightning playing on the far horizon, the air smelling of the rain that wouldn't come, she set down her coffee cup and spoke directly. "Kale." He looked at her across the table. "Who are you? Not what are you. Who?" He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. The lightning flickered silently in the window behind him, illuminating his face in brief, ghostly flashes. Then he spoke. Not the short, flat words she'd gotten used to. Longer, measured, but longer. "My people call themselves NDE, he said. "You call us Apache." She already knew that. She didn't say so. "My father was a chief of the Chiricahua band. His name meant stone that does not break. I was his only son." A pause. "I was taken 14 months ago, by men who came at night, who knew exactly where our camp was. Someone told them." Clara set down her cup very carefully. "I was brought north, sold 3 times. His voice was absolutely flat, the way the desert is flat. Not because there's nothing there, but because what's there is too big to describe with ordinary features. "The last men who held me were the ones who brought me to Red Rock Flats. The Comanche raiders," Clara said. "They were not Comanche." His eyes met hers with quiet certainty. "They wore Comanche things. They were not Comanche men." Clara felt something cold move through her despite the heat of the evening. "Then who were they?" Cale's jaw tightened slightly, the first real visible crack in that extraordinary stillness. "Men with money behind them," he said. "Men who wanted me gone. Who wanted the son of the chief of the Chiricahua gone. So that when the time came to take the land, there would be no one left who carried the right to refuse." The room was very quiet. Clara looked at the man across her table in the flickering light and felt the full, terrible weight of what she had accidentally walked into land on her shoulders with a heaviness that stole the breath from her lungs. This was not a story about a man who'd had bad luck. This was a story about a war being fought in the shadows before anyone realized the battle had started. "Are they looking for you?" she asked. "Yes," he said simply. "How long until they find you?" He tilted his head slightly. Something moved in those black eyes, not fear, she realized. Something far more complex than fear. Something that was grief and resolve and patience braided together into something almost unbearable to look at. They may already know where I am, he said. Clara looked out the window. The lightning was closer now. The distant horizon glowed with it, pale, silent, relentless. And somewhere beneath the thunder, just barely audible to a person who knew how to listen, was the sound of horses. More than one, moving in the dark. Clara moved without thinking. She was at the window in 3 steps, pressing herself to the wall beside it, peering out at the flat, moon-washed land beyond the paddock. Her hand was already reaching for the rifle she kept hanging beside the door, a Winchester, long and reliable, the one piece of equipment she had never let fall into disrepair. "How many?" she said quietly. Cale was already standing. He had crossed the room without sound. She hadn't even heard him move. He stood beside her, head angled, reading the darkness with something beyond ordinary sight. "4," he said. "Maybe 5. She couldn't see them yet. She could barely hear them. Just that thin, rhythmic suggestion of hoofbeats that might have been thunder and might not have been. But she trusted his read of it. She already trusted his read of everything. "Friends of yours or theirs?" she asked. "Theirs." She checked the Winchester. "Full. Good." "Barn," she said quietly. "There's a shotgun behind the feed crates. Top shelf. Shells in the box next to it." She didn't look to see if he moved. She was already positioning herself, dropping the front window latch, opening it a careful inch, giving herself a sight line across the yard. The paddock gate, the trail coming in from the southwest. It was several long minutes before she saw them. 5 riders, as he'd said. Moving slowly now, deliberately slowly, the walk of men who want to be seen and heard and calculated, who want the person inside to feel the weight of their number before anything is said. They stopped at the edge of the yard. One of them, a wide man on a pale horse, wearing a long duster, called out from the dark. "Hello, the house. We're looking for a property belonging to a woman named Voss. Looking for a runaway that was reported in the area." Clara's eyes moved across the 5 shapes on the dark road. They were spaced apart with a professional, practiced distance. Not casual men. Not cowboys passing through. She raised her voice, keeping it flat and unimpressed. "This is Voss property. I don't take on runaways and I don't harbor trouble. You've got the wrong ranch." The wide man on the pale horse tilted his head. "Now, ma'am, we heard different. Heard a woman came through Red Rock Flats. Bought a particular individual off Tolliver's trading post. That individual is wanted in connection with a violent matter down in the territory." Violent matter. Clara filed that phrasing away carefully. That was the kind of language men used when they needed a legal-sounding reason for something that had no legal foundation. "I bought no one," she called back. "I don't know what Tolliver told you, but he's a man who says what he gets paid to say." Silence from the dark. Then the wide man spoke again, quieter this time. "We're going to need to come on to the property and have a look, ma'am. No offense meant." "None intended, none taken," Clara said calmly. "But any man who comes through that paddock gate uninvited gets a Winchester answer. I've run this property alone for 3 years. I know how to make that kind of statement." Another silence. Longer this time. She heard one of the other riders say something low and she couldn't make out the words, but she heard the tone. Frustrated. Calculating. Then she heard something else. A sound from behind the house. Subtle. Almost nothing. But in the perfect, held-breath quiet she'd created in that room, it was like a shout. One of them had already gone around. She spun from the window just as the back door. She never locked it, swung open. The man who came through was tall, lean, in dark clothing with a hat pulled low. He had a pistol in his right hand and he was raising it toward her with the practiced speed of someone for whom this was not a new experience. Clara swung the Winchester up. But she was a half-second behind. She knew it. She felt it. The cold mathematics of it. And then something happened very fast. Cale came out of the dark corner of the room. She hadn't even known he was there. He'd come back inside without a sound. And he moved like something she had no language for. Not like a person fighting. Like water finding its path through stone. Utterly without hesitation. Utterly without waste. He caught the man's gun arm at the wrist with both hands, twisted in a way that produced a sharp, ugly sound. And then the pistol was on the floor and the tall man was gasping and folding and Cale's forearm was across his throat, pressing him back against the wall with a controlled, terrible stillness. The tall man went very still. Clara turned back to the front window. The 4 riders in the yard had not moved. She levered the Winchester, stepped to the door, opened it, and stood in the doorway in full view. "Your man in my kitchen," she said, her voice carrying across the yard like the crack of a branch, "is alive because I said so. He'll stay that way if you ride back the direction you came from. Right now. Tonight." The wide man on the pale horse said nothing, but he was looking at her differently now. Clara raised the rifle. "I won't say it twice," she said. The moment stretched like taffy, slow, impossible, wavering in the heat of its own tension. And then the wide man turned his horse. The others followed, one by one, pulling back from the yard, back down the dark trail, back into the desert from which they'd come. Clara stayed in the doorway until the last sound of hoofbeats had faded completely. Then she lowered the rifle, stepped back inside, and looked at the tall man in her kitchen. Still pressed against the wall, still under Cale's forearm, but conscious and white-faced with pain. She looked at Cale. He looked at her. In the lamplight, she saw something on his face that hadn't been there before. Not gratitude, not relief, recognition. Like a man who had finally found something he'd almost stopped believing was real. She looked at the man against the wall. "You're going to tell me who sent you," she said quietly. "And then we're going to talk about what happens next." The man's name was Red. He said it with the resigned air of someone who's already decided the situation is too far gone for lies to help. He was a hired tracker, not a lawman, not a ranger, not any kind of official. Private man working for private money. Clara sat across the kitchen table from him. Cale stood by the wall. Red's right wrist was wrapped with a cloth. Clara had done that herself, not out of sympathy, but because a man in serious pain is harder to get useful information from. "Who hired you?" Clara said. Red looked at the table. "Red." Her voice was flat. "Look at me." He looked up. His eyes went briefly to Cale, then back to Clara. There was something in that glance. Something complicated and uncomfortable. Not just fear of Cale. Something older. The look of a man who has tried not to think too carefully about what he's been part of. "Man named Hargrove," he said finally. "Calvin Hargrove." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Clara kept her face neutral. "The land agent." Red nodded. She'd heard the name. Most people in this part of the territory had heard the name. Calvin Hargrove was a land agent operating out of Tucson. The kind of man who moved in well-appointed offices and signed papers and attended dinners with government men. The kind of man who was never in the room when the dirty work was done, but who was always holding the money when it was over. He had been buying up territory land at rates that made serious ranchers nervous, using legal instruments, contracts, and occasionally it was whispered, things that were considerably less legal. He had eyes on the Chiricahua country. Everyone knew it. What Clara hadn't known, what she was only now beginning to understand, was the full shape of it. "Tell me what you know," she said. Red told her. Came out in pieces, the way confessions always do. Reluctant at first, then faster, the way water moves through a crack that's already been opened. Hargrove had been planning the acquisition of a large section of Chiricahua land for 2 years. He had allies in the territorial government. He had contracts waiting to be signed the moment the Apache people's claim to the territory could be legally dismantled. The obstacle was the Chiricahua chief and his lineage. As long as the son of the chief was alive and present, there was a line of authority that certain treaty provisions, badly worded, rarely enforced, but technically existing, could be invoked around. Hargrove needed the son gone, Red said, not meeting Cale's eyes. Not killed, necessarily. Just gone. Removed. Disappeared into the trade routes where no one would look for him. And the men who took him, Clara said carefully, the ones dressed as Comanche raiders. Hargrove hired them. Men who knew the land. Who had people in the Apache camps that told them when and where. Someone told them. Cale had said that on the first night. standing in her kitchen by lamplight, still and quiet as stone. She looked at him now. His face was unreadable, but his hands, which had been perfectly still this entire conversation, had closed slowly into fists at his sides. "The informant," she said to Red. "Who was it?" "In the Apache camp." Red finally looked up. "I don't know the name. I swear to you I don't." Hargrove kept that close. "All I know is it was someone who had access to camp movements. Someone trusted." Clara looked at Cale. He said nothing, but something had shifted in him, something profound and terrible. It moved through him the way an earthquake moves, deep underground, barely visible on the surface but changing everything below. He turned and walked to the back door. "Cale," Clara began. "I need to be outside," he said quietly. She didn't stop him. She heard the door close, then silence. Clara turned back to Red. She studied him for a long moment. "How long before Hargrove sends more men?" "He won't stop," Red said. There was something that might have been regret in his voice or might have been simple realism. "He never has. This is too much money." "How many men does he have access to?" "Enough." Red looked at her directly. "Ma'am, you should understand something. You are in serious danger. You bought that man. You're harboring him. In Hargrove's view, that makes you part of the problem." "He's welcome to that view," Clara said flatly. Red stared at her. "You're not scared," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was something closer to bewilderment. "I'm very scared," Clara said. "I just don't let it make decisions for me." She stood. "You're going to leave tonight. You're going to walk your horse, not ride it, until you're 3 miles from this property. And you are not going to tell Hargrove where we are. Not tonight." "And why would I do that?" Red said carefully. Clara looked at him steadily. "Because I know exactly who Calvin Hargrove is and what he does. And I know that a man who works for someone like that sleeps with one eye open. You don't report back useful information tonight, and Hargrove will wonder about you eventually. When he does, you're going to need people who don't work for him." She let that sit. "Tonight," she continued, "you have the chance to become someone who is owed a favor by people who pay their debts." Red looked at the table, at the wrapped wrist, at the door through which Cale had walked. "You're playing a long game," he said. "The only kind worth playing," she said. He left 20 minutes later. Clara stood on the porch and watched him go. The desert was enormous around her, still, dark, pinned with stars. Somewhere out there, beyond the red rock walls, Hargrove's plans were moving forward like a river that doesn't know it's heading toward a fall. She stepped off the porch and walked to where Cale was standing in the yard, looking north. She stood beside him, said nothing. After a while he spoke. "There is a place," he said, "where my people are. Still, where my father may still be." He paused. "I need to go back." "I know," Clara said. "There will be more men. Between here and there. I know that too." He turned and looked at her with those black, unreadable eyes. "Why?" he asked. Just that. Not elaborating. She understood the question perfectly. She thought about it for a long moment. "Because something wrong is happening," she said finally. "And I'm in a position to do something about it. That's generally been enough reason for me." He held her gaze. Then he looked back at the northern horizon. "We leave before dawn," he said. "I'll make coffee," she answered. They rode out at 4 in the morning, when the stars were still thick above the desert and the air was cold enough to see your breath. Clara had packed light and smart food for 5 days, ammunition, medical supplies, 2 wool blankets. Nothing that would slow them. She knew the northern trails reasonably well, but only to a point. Beyond the ridgeline she called the Broken Crown, the land became territory she had never traveled. Apache land. Land that had its own language and its own rules. She was riding into it with the only guide who knew it from the inside. They did not speak much in the first hours. The desert does not encourage it. The pre-dawn is a serious kind of quiet, full of small sounds and large distances. Clara rode and watched the trail ahead. Cale rode beside her sometimes and slightly ahead at others, reading the land with those constantly tracking eyes. By sunrise, they were deep into country she didn't recognize. The landscape had changed, the flat, clay-red plains giving way to something more dramatic. Great broken formations of rock, layered in ochre and violet and deep rust, rose on all sides in shapes that suggested size far beyond what a human mind was built to comfortably hold. Dry arroyos cut the ground in sharp angles. Ancient river paths, the memory of water in stone. Kale was increasingly present in this land in ways that were hard to articulate. He began to move differently. A subtle thing, the slight forward lean in the saddle easing, the ever-present tension behind his eyes loosening by small degrees. He was coming back to something. You could see it in him the way you can see light beginning in the sky before the actual sunrise. A slow, steady return. He pointed things out without being asked. A rock formation that marked a specific watershed. A cluster of plants that indicated a water source below the surface. Once, he stopped and crouched beside the trail and studied the ground for a long time before looking up and angling them half a mile west of the route Clara would have taken. 3 miles later, she understood why. They skirted the edge of what might have been a watcher's position. A high outcropping of rock that would have given anyone camped there a perfect view of the trail below. "There are people watching these approaches?" she asked. "Always," he said. "These are the outer boundaries. My people have watched this land since before your country had a name." She didn't take offense at that. It was simply a fact. By midday they were seen. She didn't know it at first. She knew it only when Cale went very still on his horse and then raised his right hand slowly, palm out, toward a ridge line to their left. A gesture so specific and deliberate it could only be language. And after a long moment, something moved on the ridge. A figure. Then two. Then several, standing in the sun with an absolute stillness that had its own dignity. Clara kept very still. She kept her hands visible. The next hours moved in a register she didn't quite have access to. Not because she was excluded, but because she was witnessing something that belonged to a world that operated by rules older and deeper than anything she had been taught. There were riders who came down from the ridge eventually. There were words in the NDE language spoken between Cale and the first man who approached. A lean, older man with gray in his hair and a face that showed nothing. And then the older man looked at Cale for a long, searching moment. And Cale said something. One sentence. Short. And the older man reached out and gripped Cale's forearm, the one with the deliberate scars, in a hold so tight Clara could see the knuckles whiten. Something broke open in the older man's face. Just for a moment. Just briefly. He composed himself almost immediately, but Clara had seen it. She understood, without being told, who she was looking at. Stone that does not break. The chief. His father. She stayed back. She asked for nothing. She watched as the camp moved around this reunion with a careful, respectful distance, honoring the weight of it while allowing the people it belonged to carry it themselves. Later, much later, when the fire was high and the night had settled, Cale sat beside her at the edge of the camp. He told her what he'd learned. The informant had been found, not by Hargrove's people, but by Cale's. Someone who had been afraid, someone who had been pressured, someone young and weak and frightened who had broken under things he wasn't equipped to carry. That person had already faced the consequences that the Chiricahua law had determined. Cale did not share the details. He told her that his father had already sent riders to other bands. That there were conversations being had, quietly, with certain men in the territorial government. Men who opposed Hargrove. Men who had been looking for exactly the kind of documented, witnessed account of private kidnapping and land conspiracy that Red, as it turned out, had already provided in exchange for certain protections. The wheels of consequence had been set in motion. Calvin Hargrove did not know it yet. "He'll find out," Clara said. "Yes," Cale said. "He will." They sat for a time in the firelight. "What happens to you now?" she asked. He was quiet for a while. The fire crackled. Above them, the Arizona sky was so full of stars it seemed almost too much to look at directly. "I stay," he said. "My people are still here. The land is still here. There is still work." Clara nodded slowly. She thought about the ranch, the leaking windmill, the garden that needed tending. The long, solitary rhythms of the life she'd built out of loss and stubbornness and the particular kind of faith that doesn't name itself. "Then I go back," she said. He turned and looked at her. $2 silver, he said quietly. She looked at him sidelong. "Don't." "It was not nothing," he said. "It was not nothing what you did." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Neither was this," she said. She lifted her coffee cup. He lifted his. In the firelight, surrounded by the vast, indifferent, magnificent desert, they sat together in the kind of silence that is not empty at all, but full, impossibly full, of everything that doesn't require words. Clara rode home alone. Took her 2.5 days. The desert was exactly what it had always been, enormous, ancient, profoundly unconcerned with the small, burning lives that moved through it. She rode through the heat of 2 days and the cold of 2 nights and arrived at her ranch at dawn on the 3rd morning. The windmill was still creaking. The garden needed water. Her bay horse nickered at her from the paddock. She went inside. She made coffee. She sat at the table where Red had confessed, where Cale had spoken his first full sentences, where she had made decisions that would follow her for the rest of her life, and she drank her coffee while the morning light moved slowly across the floor. 3 months later, she received a letter. It had no return address. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, slightly angular in the way of someone who had learned written English as a second language. It said, "The matter you know about has been resolved. A name you know has been made accountable. The land remains." No signature. But in the bottom corner of the paper, pressed faintly but unmistakably into the surface, was a small geometric symbol. The same one she had seen on the back of his left hand that first evening by lamplight. Clara sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about $2 silver, about chains on a floor, about a voice in the dark that sounded like something between a prayer and a song, about a man who had been an Apache prince the whole time she was treating him like a question she hadn't yet figured out how to ask. She thought about what Red had said, "You're playing a long game." She thought about the fact that sometimes the most important moments in a life arrive without ceremony, without warning, in the back corner of a dusty trading post in a town that doesn't appear on any map, when you put $2 silver on a counter for reasons you can't fully explain even to yourself. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it inside the cover of the book on her shelf, made herself another cup of coffee. Outside, the windmill turned. The desert held its silence. The morning went on being beautiful and hard and indifferent in the way only truly ancient things can afford to be. And somewhere, far to the north, on land that had never stopped being his, a man who carried the name Thunder born from silence stood on a red rock ridge in the early morning sun, and breathed free. There are stories the history books leave out, stories too quiet for official records, stories that lived in the space between $2 and the vast, star-filled Arizona sky. What would you have done in her place? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if the story moved you, if it stayed with you even a little, share it with someone who loves a good Western tale. We'll see you at the next fire.